Good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up so early for us today. A few things to just make you aware of before we begin properly. If you have not already checked out, then you need to do so in the break. Checkout is by 12 o'clock today. Also, our lovely wall of Post-it notes at the back. Could you please go and move any of the Post-it notes in accordance with any of the conversations you've had over the last day? And also, if you have further conversations today, move them at the end. We will be taking photos at the end of today, and we would love to see some movement has actually happened. We've seen people look. We haven't seen anyone brave enough to take a Post-it off and shift it above that line. So aside from that, I am delighted to introduce Keith Grint and Claire Holt. Keith has done some work already on the ILP, I think on a module earlier this year in March, possibly? Don't know. Okay. Keith is the Professor of Public Leadership at Warwick University, and Claire is a doctoral researcher from Warwick. So.
Good, thank you. Morning. Just to remind you, if you do shift one of the pink things, we'll be taking a photograph of who it is who shifts it, so we'll know who it is who said it. You think I'm joking, don't you? I'll just start with a story about the bell. I used to have a very recalcitrant group. In fact, when I was teaching in Oxford a few years ago, it was a first-year group, and they would not shut up at the beginning of the lecture. So I thought the thing to do was to bring a bell in. So I brought the bell in, and I'd stand up, and I'd ring the bell, and there were probably 300 students in the room, and they would just ignore the bell and keep talking. So the second time, I brought the bell in, but I took the clanger out, and I rang a silent bell, and it was instant silence. I don't know what that implies, but... All right, let me just answer this question. What are your 8 global policies for ethical practice? Does anyone like to name them? Code of conduct? Anyone brave enough to stand up and tell me what are the 8 policies? Anybody know what they are? We might have 1 or 2 people. What does that say about something, if most of you don't know what they are? I want you to think about that. I want you to think about the number of pinks on the wall behind you. Because if you knew what they were and they were important to you and they made a difference to your life, there wouldn't be very many pinks over there. But there are lots of pinks. That's not unusual. I don't know any organization that wouldn't have more pinks than yellows, which implies something about how difficult it is to do this. So what I want you to do, first of all, is these are the 8, in case you were confused, in case you've been bribing people for years. Come and see me afterwards. If you've been bribing people for years, you're not supposed to. But I want you to think about the importance of this. I want you to think about the importance of this to this. I just want you to spend 20 minutes now on your tables thinking about this. What difference do these make to your everyday practice at work? What difference do the policies make to your everyday practice at work? I might give you 20, but if you look bored, I'll give you 15. It's now 25 to, so at 5 to or thereabouts, I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask you for some reflections from the table, okay? 20 minutes. What difference does it make? Right, let's see how we got on. Any thoughts from anybody on the tables? What difference this stuff makes? Any thoughts? Yes?
Just some, first of all, we collectively spend more time in this territory, in this space, thinking about these issues. What difference it's made.
Can you all hear? You want to shout a bit?
Yeah, okay. We just spend more time thinking about this stuff. We're more attuned, I think, to ethical issues. That's one difference. We talked about some examples of changes to local market behaviours with respect to our relationship with teachers and customers, challenging existing behaviours, introducing new ones. We acknowledge there's a lot of ambiguity around, so spending time thinking, seeking clarification, and also we find ourselves asking the question, what would this look like? Whether that's a decision or an activity if someone came from outside the organisation and just looked at data, looked at words, so we're conscious of that dimension,
Right.
the way we perhaps work to
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
I think the view of the table was that those policies make a significant difference to everyday life, even if you can't name all eight, you know the ideas and principles
Right.
behind all eight, even if you can't quote them. That said, some policies were known better than others. I think there was a marked difference. I think with some adds consistency, removes discretion, provides a framework that helps people say no and answer questions. It's not an individual manager exercising their individual judgment, it's the organisation's view. There was quite a lot of conversation about the whistleblowing and what a positive impact that makes in terms of empowering people and having a hidden eye across the organisation, makes people careful. There was some questions about the impact in terms of the administrative work and some of the frustrations, and that we're in a catch-up phase, and there's a sense in which we haven't quite worked out the best way to operate administratively. It has had an impact in terms of exiting certain markets, and that was it.
Okay, thank you. Can I just pick up on the whistleblowing thing? So I think you said something like whistleblowing is really useful. Is that what you said? Empowers people. Is that something generally people accept? Whistleblowing is something very useful. I remember last year, Claire and I were doing some work for the Royal College of Nursing in Scotland, and their argument is whistleblowing is an admission of failure. If you have to get to the whistleblowing, you've failed. So there is something locked into here about the importance of the policies and why people would accept or don't accept the policies. So the whistleblowing would be an example that the organisation as a whole has not complied with its own policies, and that's why they're whistleblowing. So whistleblowing acts as both positive and negative in some ways. It can be either a good sign or a bad sign. Anything else? Anybody else want to say something?
Can I say something?
Yes, question.
I think it is giving an opportunity to actually improve the organization.
Whistleblowing you're talking about? Yeah.
At this
Yeah.
point of time.
Yeah.
So what we are hoping is, as we go forward, that activity will come down.
Okay.
Yes, you are absolutely
Yeah.
right. When we reach a stage where there is
Right.
no whistleblowing, we can say, yes, we completely change.
So whistleblowing is a way of guiding the organisation to the right path, if it's veering off the right path. Okay.
And a lot of the whistleblowing has been around activities which started, their genesis as well before we put in these policies, and
Yeah.
it's enabled people, it's liberated people to speak out and enable us to root these things out. Most of the incidents that we get do not relate to current breaches which have been newly initiated.
Okay.
So it's actually, again, I think it was Ramadan, wasn't it? I think
Yeah.
it's a very healthy period of time. where
And
it's
most
all
of
bubbling up.
Yeah.
People are using it as an opportunity to air things.
Right.
So that there's a sense of cleaning up.
Okay.
And most of them, at least in what I'm aware, has been about past practice.
That's what I'm.
So what we're saying is,
Yeah.
it is making us aware that there has been a practice like that.
Right.
We need to correct.
Yeah.
So serving that purpose as well.
So let me just get a feel from the room. Are these the kinds of policies and the values that are embedded in the policies that you think are positive and appropriate? Does anyone not think these are our positive values? Anyone brave enough to say, I don't think these are positive values?
Well, I won't say that, but that's it. But they're all, these are a mixture of things.
Right.
I mean, they are slightly messy in the way
Yeah.
they've come about. There's all, some need to review because they've been put in place quite quickly.
Yeah.
But some of these are legally driven as well as value driven.
Yeah.
It's not always clear which is which.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a legal aspect to it, is that a positive or a negative, but it's a real constraint on us.
Okay. So where do these values come from then? The values that are in here that are not the legal values, where do the values come from? From these? Where do they come from? This is an innocent question. I'm asking you. I have no idea where they came from.
You're having a international company and in many regions, we mainly tend to work with our local trade culture.
Yeah.
So some trade culture that might apply there may not be suitable for the market. I think as an international company, you cannot work in different environments with different trade cultures, so you really need a global standardization.
Okay.
That's over those
That's what they're intended to do, or at least partly.
Yes.
But where did they come from?
I get the feeling that there is a leaning towards what you could loosely describe as Western culture or Anglo-Saxon
Right.
culture, which doesn't always marry up that well with other parts of the world.
But Peter, I think those issues, the ones that are very Western, and I'd agree with you, are the ones I think that have been promulgated by the law. So we've got this very rigorous Bribery Act and the US Farm Corrupt Practices Act, and they're Western views of what should happen around the world. So the ones that are the most Western in there
Yeah.
come from things that are legal requirements.
The end goal are global standards, but where they're coming from, where they're leaning from,
Yeah.
I would describe as originating in those Anglo-Saxon, Western type.
I just think it's important to think about where they come from for this reason. Last year I was in Glasgow, I think, working with an NHS trust, and the chief exec asked me if I'd come and do a Wicked Problems Day with him, and I said, well, this is what I normally do. I do the presentation, then we talk on the groups about the issues and the problems of the organisation. And he said, no, I don't want you to do that. I want you to get the groups to work out how they're going to embed the values in the organisation, the new values. And I said, well, what new values are you talking about? And he said, oh, I was reading a Harvard Business Review report last month, and they've got 10 really good values, which apparently guarantee success. So what I'm going to do is I've got these 10 values, and I want the organisation to think about how they're going to embed them. I said, oh, that'll be interesting. So I came along and I did the first talk, and I said, right, so I've talked for an hour and a half, and now we're going to do some work. The chief executive at the back wants you to think about how you're going to get these values into the organisation. They're on an encapsulated paper in front of you. They come from a Harvard Business Review report. These values guarantee you success in the world. And he wants you to know, and wants you to work out how you're going to embed them into the organisation, but I don't want you to do that. I want you to think about whether they're the right values or not. And I can see the chief exec starting to smoke at the back at this point in time, but he's a long way off, so I don't really care. And then, so we had half an hour of group work, and I said, any responses from the table? And one guy stood up, and he said, these values are a complete load of, and I won't tell you what he said. And I said, oh, that's an interesting comment. Why did you make that comment? And he said, because I work in blood transfusion, and 2 of my people last week risked their necks to get blood to 2 different hospitals across the mountains in the rubbish cars that we give them. And they didn't do that because of these crap values. They did that because of the values they already hold, which is why they're working in this organisation. And everybody stood up and clapped him. And the chief exec went out for a break. And bless him, when he came back, we re-talked this, and he said, I think we need to start thinking about how we get the values that they think they hold are important into the organisation a bit more up front. And that's what we did. So it's worth, I'm not saying these values are no good. I'm not talking about that. I'm asking you to think about, are these your values? Are the values embedded in this your values? Because if they're not, you're in the wrong organisation. And if they are, we've got to think about how you get them to work properly. Yes?
Well, the way I look at it, the last point, high risk, is actually a reflection of why some of these have been drafted.
Yeah.
It is to reduce our risk exposure. In some cases, I don't think it's completely with a view to embed our values.
Okay. Yep.
We have a code of conduct which covers, I think, our values more effectively in the sense of laying them out. Hopefully, I think these reflect that code of conduct.
Okay.
So in terms of values, I think that's a more helpful direct route to talking about what our values are.
Does everyone know what the code of conduct is?
Yes.
You'd like to tell me what it is? Someone like to stand up and tell me what the code of conduct is? There was a comment coming from somewhere here. Yeah.
Well, I was trying to get in on the point about values, and I think because 99% of our staff around the world, where these policies contain value statements, they're entirely consistent with the majority of our staff's behaviour, and I think the values come from our staff. They're driving across countries doing blood transfusions. for education systems, to use your comparison.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Where do all the pink things come from?
Sorry, can we go just back to that
Yeah.
values question as one of the items that was discussed on the table here? It's not always the case that all of these policies always embed everybody's values. So, for example, because of the legal form of the enterprise that we are,
Yeah.
well, there are constraints on how we can give to charity.
Yeah.
So it may be that people would like to give more to
Yes.
charity, and I think there's a sort of sense of charities other than the charity that we are ourselves. And you know, it may be that people want to do those
Yeah.
things, but to enable us to do what we do in the way that we do it,
All right.
there are those legal constraints. So I don't really
Okay.
think it necessarily
So-
has to be the case that all of these
No.
just embed values. They can embed also other
Okay.
things that we have
So
to
the
do.
values that are in here shouldn't contradict the values, but they might not be exactly in line with them.
Well, in some cases, if lots of people here want to give lots more to charity or
Mm.
something like that, they may act to prevent them from doing things in certain ways.
Yeah.
People obviously can do them in different ways. But if we want to, if one of our overriding aims is to obey laws, say for example, and so on and so forth, then it may be that we
Yeah.
have to have things which are not specifically value-oriented with these policies.
Okay.
I think, these values, I think, are more or less universal. And they have been practiced for many years. They've been formalized after the Bribery and Fraud Act was passed. But I think that, for example, whistleblowing was always there. I mean, now it's been formalized and there's a system, but it didn't have been in place for years. So it's just that now it has been documented and it is being discussed much more and more. But I think that they have been there for a while.
Mm-hmm. So everybody happy with where we are? Don't seem to have a problem with OUP?
I guess the question I'm asking myself is how this would differ from the policies for any other organisation and what kind of makes us special.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with pink stuff because I think just because you've got values doesn't mean say necessarily worked out all your inner demons, and then there's always a few inner demons that you need to be working out. But I'm thinking about what makes that special, and perhaps the code of conduct for me is something that's a bit more of a reflection of our personality as an organisation.
Okay. Let's just hold on to that then. I want you to think about this. I want to think about Enron. This is the letter from Ken Lay. As officers and employees of Enron, call its subsidiaries and its affiliated companies, Enron or collectively the company, we are responsible for conducting the business affairs of the company in accordance with all applicable laws and in a moral and honest manner. To make certain that we understand what is expected of us, Enron has adopted certain policies with the approval of the Board of Directors, all of which are set forth in the enclosed booklet, revised July 2000. Please note that Enron has added the principles of human rights, provided further description of our business ethics policy with respect to our legal contracts, the selection of outside counsel, provided additional information with respect to the criminal penalties and civil fines assessed by the US government under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and clarified Enron's policy with respect to conflicts of interest, investments and outside business of interest of employees. The Code of Conduct contains common sense rules of conduct with which the great majority of Enron employees routinely conform. However, I ask that you read them carefully and completely, and that, as you do, you reflect your past actions to make certain you have complied with the policies. It's absolutely essential that you fully comply with these policies in the future. If you have any questions, talk them over with your supervisor, manager, or Enron legal counsel. And this is one of the values. This is one of the values. There are a 64-page book of ethics. Excellence. We are satisfied with nothing less than the very best in everything we do. Enron stands on the foundation of its vision and values. Every employee is educated about the company's vision and values and expected to conduct business with other employees, partners, contractors, suppliers, vendors, and customers, keeping in mind respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. Everything we do evolves from Enron's vision and values. At Enron, we treat others as we expect to be treated ourselves. We believe in respect for the rights of all individuals and are committed to promoting an environment characterized by dignity and mutual respect for employees, customers, contractors, suppliers, partners, community members, and representatives of all levels of government. We are dedicated to conducting business according to all applicable local and international laws and regulations, including but not limited to the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and with the high professional and ethical standards. Agreements, whether contractual or verbal, will be honored. No bribes, bonuses, kickbacks, lavish entertainment, or gifts will be given or received in exchange for special position, price or privilege. Relations with the company's many publics, customers, stockholders, governments, employees, suppliers, press and bankers will be conducted in honest candour and fairness. Laws and regulations affecting the company will be obeyed. Even the laws and business practices of foreign nations may differ from those in effect in the United States. The applicability of both foreign and US laws to the company's operations will be strictly observed. Illegal behaviour on the part of any employee in the performance of company duties will be neither condoned nor tolerated. End. So what does that tell you? Apart from the fact that I can speak quite quickly. What is that? They ticked a box. This is the danger. This is the danger if you don't actually get people to agree with the box. There's no point in just ticking it. You should act in accordance with the rule, not from fear of punishment or some other incentive, but out of respect for the rule. This is Blackburn's book, actually one of your VSI books on ethics, one of the quotes he makes. So it's not that the law isn't important if you know E.P. Thompson's work. E.P. Thompson makes an argument that the rule of law is absolutely crucial under all organizations and all societies, because that gives you the framework to be able to say we should have less pink and more yellow. Enables you to say things and do things that you couldn't hitherto do. But I want you to think about, just because you've got the policies up and everybody seems to agree with them, doesn't mean that's it. All right, so let me get back to what I was going to talk about. I want to think about whether ethics are black and white or grey. So I'll just run very quickly through some arguments about that. Then I'll give you some empirical examples, some very short case studies of what I would regard as grey ethics, because a lot of ethical work is based on the assumption that we know in advance whether it's right or it's wrong. It's patently obvious. We're either criminal or we're not criminal, as opposed to an argument which is, it's usually quite difficult to work out what you should be doing in some circumstances. And at the end of this, I'm going to get Claire to talk about blame culture. Claire has an air traffic background, and the air traffic, or the air industry, is probably the most advanced in terms of thinking about how you deal with blame culture and how you get beyond blame culture. So I'll be asking her to finish off with some examples from that. So let's just get on to ethics generally. There are lots of versions of ethics. I'm just going to look at two very quickly. Bentham's teleological or consequentialist approach, and then Kant's deontological approach. So let's go to Bentham first of all. Consequential, teleological. What's the consequence of the act that you're about to engage in is the most important thing you need to worry about. A moral action is one which produces a good consequence. We should strive to maximize pleasure and minimize the pain for both individual and collective. But the priority goes to the aggregate, and then the greatest pleasure for the greatest number is his conventional phrase. And the consequence of that is usually these kinds of examples. Should you kill one person to harvest their organs for the rest because the consequences are beneficial? If you've got a choice between killing one person and 10 people, should you pull the lever so that you kill one rather than 10? These are theoretical cases, but we have a colleague who comes and talks to the police group who talks about the consequence of deciding either 100 people die or 1,000 people die. And it's not a theoretical case. It's actually what happened to him in Bosnia. So these are not just theoretical issues. These are absolutely crucial issues about how you think about what you're going to do. Torture is the one that comes up the most frequently with regards to some of these ethical practices. Should you torture a suspected terrorist to secure information? Yes, if the consequences are beneficial to the majority according to this kind of approach. But do we know what the consequences of this kind of act might be? What if the other terrorists decide to kill more people as a consequence of you torturing the first terrorist? In that case, you shouldn't torture the first terrorist. Not because it's wrong, but because the consequences are problematic. Is it okay to torture the terrorist's children? If the terrorist refuses to tell you where the bomb is, should you get his kids out and start pulling their limbs off? Yes, if the consequences are correct and useful for the majority. If the utility of the act is good, then you should do it. All kinds of problems emerge from this. The first one is how long are the consequences to be established? This is Chou En-lai, who's asked about what are the consequences of the French Revolution, and he always responded, allegedly, it's too early to tell. And secondly is the link between the means and the end. Wouldn't torture change the relationships between the state and the citizen? Isn't the point of what you're doing is to protect the state and protect the values that you've got? In which case, torturing somebody actually undermines the value you're supposed to be supporting. So can you separate out means and ends? Robespierre certainly thought you could. You could achieve virtue by using terror. So here's some examples to think about, some real examples. 2001, Philip Morris are told by the Czech government they're going to increase tax on cigarettes. So Philip Morris, the cigarette manufacturer, did some research into the cost of tax and the effect of smoking, and it suggested since smokers impose higher costs on society when they're alive but lower costs when they're dead, because the pensions are much reduced, and they don't live very long in hospital, they just die quite quickly, it's actually beneficial to encourage smoking. So they argued it saves the Czech government about $147 million a year. Great example of a consequentialist approach. We should encourage people to smoke and drink themselves stupid. That way we just get their pensions back. And then 1970s, the Ford Pinto example. This car had a petrol tank in the wrong place, and as soon as it got crashed into from behind, it would blow up, set fire to itself. Ford could either leave the design as it was, and that would lead to about 180 extra deaths, they reckoned. On average, that cost them, each death cost them about $200,000, and 180 burn injuries, that cost them about $67,000 each. But the social benefits of change would be about $49.5 million, while the cost of Ford of changing it would be $37.5 million, so it wasn't worth it, so they didn't bother. Then they got sued. So sometimes these look really bizarre examples, but this is how insurance operates, on the basis of how much does it cost if you lose your leg. So it's not that bizarre. Second kind of approach, Kantian, deontological, duty, obligation. So a moral action is one which has moral intent. I'm not bothered about the consequences. What did you intend to do? If the consequence of your intent is problematic, that's just not your fault. You couldn't be held responsible for the consequences. You couldn't have predicted them. The important point is the intent. So the motive is more important than the consequence. Things are inherently right and wrong, and ethical rules should bind you to your actions. So Kant's knock is the most famous example here. So a murderer comes to your door and bangs on your door and asks you if the person he is trying to murder is in your house. And the question Kant sets is, should you tell the murderer that the person he wants to kill is in your house? And his answer is yes. You must absolutely tell the truth. Whether the murderer then breaks in and destroys or kills the person is not really your fault. You couldn't be held responsible for the consequences of that. You're responsible for telling the truth, but not the consequences, the intent. Benjamin Constant at the same time argues that the murderer doesn't deserve the truth, but Kant argues it's not about the murderer. It's about the duty you have to tell the truth. Sandel, in his recent book, says, well, you could tell the truth, but not endanger your friend by saying something like this. I did see you an hour ago in town. So you're telling the truth, and the consequences are not problematic. Or you could just say, yes, she's inside, but if you're coming, I'm going to kill you. So you can still tell the truth. But the important point for Kant is the intent, not the consequence. Which leads to Kant's categorical imperative, how you should act ethically in a deontological way. And these are the three aspects of it. Act only on the assumption that your act could become universal without detriment. Everybody has to do what you're about to do. Never treat people merely as a means, but always as an end in themselves. And act as if you were the universal lawmaker. And Kant's argument is if you follow these three, then you will be acting in a deontological, ethical way. This is what you should do. It's not about the consequence. So going back to your policies, you should be complying with the policies. It's not about what the consequence of the compliance is. That's not your problem. Your problem is you must comply with the policies. What happens when the rights and the duties conflict? Which duty should take priority? Now, part of the problem I have with both of those approaches is that they're both locked into a binary approach to life. This or that, one or the other. And I think sometimes those kinds of binary approaches don't help us make decisions in real life that are actually much grayer than the black and white which is implied by the binary. So origins are often regarded as lying in language. Things are right and wrong, or day and night. You don't know what day is unless you know what night is. You don't know what black is unless you know what white is. But there's also an issue about, of course, the way that the language itself constitutes reality rather than reflects reality. So even the way that you describe something, and this goes back to the important point about how you describe the policy, is a crucial aspect of how you change the world. You're not describing the world, you're changing the world through the language that you used allegedly to describe it. Let me give you two examples. This is the first one. There used to be an organization, it still exists, but it's changed, called Black Sash in South Africa. which used to be, before apartheid fell, primarily a white, middle-class women's philanthropic organisation. And I remember watching a documentary on television years and years ago, before apartheid fell, and there's a white middle-class woman talking to a group of kids, and they're on the floor in front of her, and they're all holding hands, and she says, right, children, let's just go around the room and let's just tell each other what colour skin you've got. And they go around the room, and she says, what colour is your skin? And the kid says, it's black and brown and light brown and very dark black and blah, blah, blah. And she comes to the front, and she says, well, I'm the only one left. And remember, this is a middle-class white woman. And she says, so it's just my hands left. Well, my hands are skin-coloured. That's a really important and powerful issue about what counts as normal. Normal counts as my coloured hands, not your coloured hands. So the way you describe reality changes reality. It doesn't just reflect it, it changes it. The other example I don't want you to think about is how can we have waterboarding? How come American interrogators can legitimately use waterboarding? And that seems to me to have come from a single sentence used by the man who introduced it, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Pfeiffer, who writes to President Bush and says he wants to introduce this interrogation technique, which is known colloquially as waterboarding. And this technique, I'm quoting now, will induce the misperception of suffocation on the part of the detainee. What's the interesting word in that sentence? Induce the misperception of suffocation on the part of the detainee. Misperception, because what does it do? It transfers responsibility from the doer to the receiver, from the interrogator to the person being interrogated. You think I'm drowning you, but I'm not. I've no intention of drowning you, I'm just watching you in a really weird way. If you think you're being drowned, that's your problem. So what's happening is here, I'm transferring responsibility from me to you, which means I'm not torturing you. You might think I am, but I'm not. So the way that you describe the world changes the way the world works. Which is important to think about how you construct the notion of a policy, because the way you describe it changes it. So these binaries, which exist all over the place, they exist in philosophy, Aristotelian binaries, they exist in religion, good, bad, especially Manichaeism versions of religion, modernist roots in the division between the subject and the object. Pluralists exist all over the place. Both sides of the story is what the television, BBC says all the time. We're going to have both sides of the story. When did the last time we only had two sides of a story? There are hundreds of sides to a story. Why are we only having two? Why do we have the government and the opposition? What about us? They're both crazy. And in organizational behavior, my field, McGregor's theory X and theory Y. Theory X is the assumption that people are all selfish, and therefore you have to sit on them, control them, constrain them. And theory Y is the opposite. Actually, if you give people a bit of responsibility, they take responsibility, they act responsibly. And these can be drawn directly from Hobbes and Rousseau's arguments about human nature. Friedman's argument about how you control organizations, direct control, which is the same as theory X. Sit on people, give them regulations, discipline them, observe them, watch them, and responsible autonomy. You know what to do. We already know what we're supposed to be doing. We all agree with the policies here. Just get on and do it and take some responsibility. So very different understandings of the way that the world works. Heifetz's arguments about technical and adaptive leadership, and Rittel and Webber's Tame and Wicked Problems, which I've bored some of you with before. But all of these are binaries. It's one or the other. And it's self-evident which is it, which is which. I'm not even sure it is self-evident. So most of the binaries that we've just looked at in terms of the ethical approaches imply it's relatively obvious what you should be doing. So if you've got the policy right, you know what's right, you know what's ethical. I'm going to suggest that isn't always the case. And one way of thinking about this is what most of those ethical approaches do is they set out the policy and then say, well, where's your example? And we'll fit it into the policy. But if we reverse this and say, where's the example first, not the ethical code, where's the example? And let's think about what the example implies for the ethical code. We quite often come to the conclusion that we don't quite know where it sits in the ethical code, because it isn't one or the other, it's probably a bit of both. And one way of understanding this might be Foucault's argument about rather than having it on a horizontal plane, right and wrong, black and white, why don't we just think about it on a vertical plane? And there's actually more depth to this that you need to worry about. It's not right and wrong, it's probably somewhere in the middle. So power is not positive or negative for Foucault, it's positive and negative. I just think about some people who've argued that maybe a grey approach to life might be a better way of understanding what we might need to think about doing. So we'll start with Marcus Aurelius. You may remember him from the Gladiator film. Suffocated by his son. If you call him Commodus, what do you expect? The art of living is more like wrestling than dancing, in that it stands ready for what comes and is not thrown by the unforeseen. So I just think about that wrestling and dancing thing, because this is what dancing is about. Dancing is a set of moves which work as predicted and guarantee success. There's a right thing for you to do, and you can be taught this, and there's a wrong thing not to do. This is the equivalent of assuming that the policy in itself will sort the problem out. You know what the policy is? Problem's fixed. So the policy is like dancing. What are the rules? What am I allowed to do? What am I allowed not to do? That's it, clear. And wrestling is different. Wrestling, the set moves don't guarantee success. Each situation is different. There isn't a right way. You can be taught some of what you need to know. But because the other party involved in this particular issue of wrestling might have a different agenda, like wrestling you or resisting you, and the context is therefore constantly changing, unpredictable and difficult to analyse, which means that you don't have the black and white bit that you thought you had in the first place. It's not that simple. Think about Machiavelli as a grey theorist rather than the black and white theorist. So he's often regarded as a black and white theorist. He's often regarded as assuming this, that you must do whatever you need to do to stay in power. I'm not sure that's what he really means. And you've got to think about where Machiavelli's context is. He's writing at a time of extraordinary civil conflict, and his argument is basically in a time of civil conflict, when nobody is acting ethically, there isn't any point in you acting ethically. Because if you act ethically, what will happen is, because the others are not acting ethically, the person who is the least ethical will probably control you. The Prince, Russell called this a handbook for gangsters. Napoleon said it was the only book worth reading. So it's prohibited by the Catholic Church under its index of books. He's regarded as being unchristian when he says the end justifies the means. I don't think he says that. He actually says the good end justifies the means. The question is, what counts as the good end? That's the problem, trying to work out what the good end is. For Machiavelli, the good end is always a collective end. It's never an individual personal end, even though some of the examples he uses are personal. So he uses Cesare Borgia a lot. And for him, it's the individual which appears to be the most important. Whereas in his discourses, rather than the Prince, it becomes much clearer that he's talking about the collective end. You must do whatever you need to do for the collective end. In your case, you must do whatever you need to do for OUP. That's it. That's the collective end. It's not about you. So the Cesare Borgia case, the fact is that a man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief amongst so many who are not virtuous. Therefore, if a prince wants to maintain his rule, he must learn how not to be virtuous and to make use of this or that according to need. And Cesare Borgia was accounted cruel. Nevertheless, his cruelty of his reformed the Romagna, brought it unity and restored order and obedience. On reflection, it will be seen that there was more compassion in Cesare than in the Florentine people who, to escape being called cruel, allowed Pistoia to be devastated. So what kind of ethics is that? Utilitarian, Benthamites, the consequence. If I act ethically, we're all going to be destroyed. So I'm going to do what I need to do, consequentialist. And then Jean-Paul Sartre in his play Dirty Hands, there's an interesting argument about why his argument is if you want to engage in politics, in control, in organisation, in leadership, you have to have dirty hands. So this particular quote, the conversation is between Herder, who was the secretary of the clandestine Communist Party in this imaginary war, fictional war between what's probably Hungary and Germany. And Herder, who's the secretary, who's engaged in dirty hands, who's doing the deals, is in a conversation with Hugo. Hugo is the innocent, who doesn't think you should be engaged in these kinds of activities. And then Herder says this to Hugo: "How you cling to your purity, young man. How afraid you are to soil your hands. All right, stay pure. What good will it do? Why did you join us? Purity is an idea for a yogi or a monk. You intellectuals and bourgeois anarchists use it as a pretext for doing nothing, to do nothing, to remain motionless, arms at your sides, wearing kid gloves. Well, I have dirty hands right up to the elbows, so I've plunged them in filth and blood. What do you hope? Do you think you can govern innocently? So, interesting argument about the importance of the grey and what happens when you get grey. And Heidegger, dubious political background, but some interesting ideas. In his terms about talking about dwelling, he says, to be a human means to be on the earth. As a mortal, it means to dwell, to stay with. To dwell on something is to stay with another, to pause and consider them. A bit like Keats's negative capability, which is an argument about not being too hasty. Let's just stand back and think about this. It might look as though it's a black and white decision, but let's just not be too hasty. Let's just think about this a minute. So to dwell for Heidegger means to be at peace within a place safeguarded from danger. And because you're in a safe place, you can actually then allow the other person to say things that they couldn't otherwise say. It's that kind of construct. The other part of the construct is that to engage in this presencing, you have to engage ironically in absencing. So if you want the other person in the conversation to open up to you, you have to take yourself out of the center of attention. This is the opposite of charismatic leadership, who like to be in the center of attention. You have to be the opposite of this. You have to come into what he calls the right relation. So in contrast to traditional ethical theories which focus on ethical dilemmas, comportment, as he talks about, is a way of thinking about, you have to get an open stance, you have to allow the legitimate views of the other side to come into the open. You have to get them relaxed enough and feel safe enough to be able to say things to you that they couldn't otherwise say. This is the pink stuff at the back of the room. You put people in a safe space to be able to discuss the pink things. In other words, you have to build a relationship to engage with the other in that specific situation. It's an emergent process, not a predetermined decision. You can't know what to do in advance. The ethical decision will depend upon the situation. I'm going to come to some examples of that in a minute. And your job is therefore to create the space for that to emerge. This is a bit like Sveningsson and Alberson's extraordinarization of the mundane argument. Their argument is the mundane, the building of the relationships with people, is what differentiates between successful and unsuccessful leadership. It's rooted in relationships. It's not rooted in policies. It's rooted in relationships that will support the policies. I'll talk about Aristotle in a minute. Okay, let me just move on to some examples of this grey aspect of life. So we'll start with how I came to be interested in this. I taught at Oxford in the side school for 12 years, and then on my last day, I was just clearing my office, and I saw a sign saying, lecture, blah, 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 ethics in the MBA. I thought, well, that'll be an interesting lecture. So I sat at the back of the room, and it was given by a law lecturer, because there wasn't anybody in the business school that knew anything about ethics. So I sat at the back, and the woman lecturer who was talking about it said, okay, so before we get into the ethical policies, let me give you an example to think about. So you were in a group of 10 people, and they're walking along a tidal path. They're looking for subtidal caves. So when the tide goes out, these the caves are exposed by the absence of the water. And you come across one of these caves, and it's about a mile long. It's exposed when the tide is out. And there are 10 of you in the group, and the first 9 go into the cave. But the last person that comes in is so fat, he blocks up the hole completely. He can't get in and he can't get out. Well, the cave is about a mile deep, so there's no worry about oxygen. But the tide's coming back in 2 hours. And of the 9 people in the cave now, one's got a stick of dynamite, one's got a box of matches. What are you going to do? So probably 95% of the room said they were going to kill the man, they were going to blow him up. And then the woman said, so why are you taking this rash action? And they all said, well, the tide's coming back and we're all going to drown. And according to the consequentialist approach, the important thing is to worry about the large number rather than the smaller number. So we're going to kill him so we can all live. And she said, I don't think you've thought this through. I did tell you he's blocked the hole completely. The tide's coming back, but he's blocked the hole completely. So no water will come in, you won't drown. And when the tide goes out again, because he won't have eaten for a while, he will have slimmed down enough to escape from the hole. So you can all walk out and no one needs to die. And this hand went up and she said, yes. And the guy said, ma'am, I'm blowing the fat guy. Time is money. and I packed my bags and left Oxford. Now, my area is more to do with leadership than anything else, and there's a very interesting issue in leadership and ethics at the moment. It's trying to work out whether you need to be ethical to be successful. And there's a very strong American bias which suggests you do. So all the successful people in the world are ethical, according to this approach. And if you are unethical, you'll be unsuccessful. And if you're successful and you appear to be unethical, that's because you're not a leader, you're a dictator. Which is a very interesting linguistic move, which means you protect leadership from being unethical. It's sometimes called the Hitler question. So, is Hitler ethical? No, and he failed. Therefore, ergo, you need to be ethical, as opposed to Stalin, who had a very similar kind of approach to life and was successful until he died, but he didn't get bumped off. So what you do is you argue that all these people are dictators and therefore you protected the notion of the ethical leader, which is, I think, is an interesting problematic term. Anyway, it's also involved in these kinds of things. Why we call Alexander the Great? It's not great if you're just being killed by him, but we call him the Great. What's all that about? Hitler the Great? I don't think so. A second example is my colleague Sean Bailey, who runs a charity called My Generation in quite a rough area of North London. So his charity offices are actually in the middle of the council estate. And he talked about, he came to talk to our police group, he talked about having a new police officer, PC, who took over this particular beat. And on day one, he gets a phone call from the police station saying, you need to come down and get 2 of your people discharged because they've been arrested. And since they're your employees or they work for you, you need to come sort them out. So he goes down to the police station and says, what's going on? And the police officer said, they've been arrested for graffiti. And he said, can I see the person that arrested them, please? And the PC comes in and he said, why have you arrested these 2 people? And he said, because they were engaged in graffiti, which is a criminal offence, so I've arrested them. And Sean said, I don't think you know what the system is here. The system here is, and the agreement with the previous PC, who was here for 5 years, is that we are allowing people to do graffiti on this particular part of the estate. It's just 4 walls surrounding a football pitch. There is no graffiti anywhere else on the estate. That's the local deal. And the PC said, it's not my problem. It's a criminal offence, and I'm still going to arrest them. I'm going to charge them with graffiti, criminal damage. And then eventually Sean got the inspector down and the charges were dropped. So it's an interesting example of the black and white and the grey here. The black and white is, this is a criminal offence, we're going to charge them. But the grey is, the local agreement is, you can do it, but only here. Now, if you've seen the film Lincoln, you'll know this, quite a nice example of the difficulty that Lincoln faces in trying to get the 13th Amendment through, which is the abolition of slavery. So the background to this, the 13th Amendment was passed by the Senate on the 8th of April 1864, then by the House on the 31st of January 1865. In April he's assassinated, and the amendment is adopted on the 6th of December 1865. And here's his dilemma. So Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which frees the slaves in 10 Confederate states. It's only a temporary measure, and it's not absolutely clear he has the authority to be able to do this anyway. And the big problem is, so now what does he do? How does he get the amendment passed which will ensure that slavery is abolished? So here are the problems. If he passes the amendment before the war ends, the South might never give in, because you've just removed the purpose of their rebellion. So if you're going to make this, if you're going to abolish slavery, I'm just going to keep fighting. Second problem is if you delay the amendment until the war is ended, it might never get through, because at that point the South has a reason not to comply. The third issue is if you just rely upon rational arguments, and the amendment won't get through because it doesn't have enough support. You can't actually get it through on the basis of rational argument and empathy. They're not interested. There are not enough people interested in the abolition of slavery. And the fourth approach is the one that he takes. His colleagues, he recruits a lot of strange, interesting people, coerce, bribe, and threaten people to vote in the right direction. And that's what gets the amendment through. So what you have is the greater good is the abolition of slavery, and the problem is I'm going to have to coerce people, bribe people, and threaten people to get the vote through. So here's the problem. I can stay pure and get nothing done, or I can actually get involved in some interesting material down here and get the greater good done. That's his problem. They end up in number 4. Richard Strauss. So he's appointed president of the Reichsmusikkammer, the State Music Bureau, in 1933. This man has a very strange relationship to the Nazis. So he appears to be a supporter, but in reality he's actually quite apolitical. He's neither pro-Nazi nor anti-Nazi in a particular kind of way, but his problem is he wants to keep playing Jewish music by Jewish composers, Debussy, Mendelssohn and Mahler, and he can't do it unless he takes this post up. And more importantly for him, as this becomes apparent later on, he wants to protect his Jewish daughter-in-law Alice and their 2 sons. And if he doesn't do this, then they are likely to end up in a concentration camp and probably worse. So his dilemma is, do I need to work with the enemy to protect these people and play my music, or do I need to say I'm not doing it, and then we'll just see what happens to my daughter-in-law and I can't play the music? So he works with his Jewish librettist Stefan Zweig on a new comic opera which is actually performed in front of Himmler, interestingly enough. And then he writes a letter to Zweig, who is banned from working because he's Jewish. And he says, do you believe I am ever, in any of my actions, guided by the thought that I am German? Do you suppose Mozart was consciously Aryan when he composed? I recognize only 2 types of people, those who have talent and those who have none. So a very apolitical response here. And then the Gestapo discover this letter, Strauss is dismissed and his daughter-in-law is arrested. Then Strauss gets her released, but fails to save her mother and the other children. And in 1942, Alice is rearrested. But again, Strauss gets her released. And then he died in 1949, and this is actually his last work, 4 last songs. If you're feeling melancholic, on the edge of suicide, play this, and that'll be the end of you. Primo Levi, this is where the grey stuff comes from. The origins of the grey approach to life come from his second chapter in The Drowned and the Saved. And the question that he starts with is, why didn't more prisoners revolt in the death camps? If they had an inkling of what was going on, and it clearly wasn't going to be great, whatever happened, it wasn't going to be great, why didn't more prisoners revolt? And he says this: the network of human relationships inside the lager was not simple. It could not be reduced to the 2 blocks of victims and persecutors. The young, above all, demand clarity, their experience of the world being meagre. They do not like ambiguity. In any case, their expectation reproduces exactly that of the newcomers, to find a terrible but decipherable world in conformity with that simple model that we atavistically carry with us, we inside and the enemy outside. The world into which one was precipitated was terrible, but also indecipherable. It did not conform to any model. The enemy was all around, but also inside. The we lost its limits. One entered hoping at least for the solidarity of one's companions in misfortune. But the hoped-for allies, except in special cases, were not there. There were instead 1,000 sealed-off monads, and between them a desperate and covert continuous struggle. It was so harsh as to cause the immediate collapse of one's capacity to resist. So what we're looking for when we go in is the black and the white. At least I know who my friends are, but you go there and you have no idea who is your friend and who is your enemy. And he argues this is what causes the collapse of resistance, because you are on your own. So the newcomer was derided, and probably the hostility was motivated, like all other forms of intolerance, in an unconscious attempt to consolidate the we at the expense of the they. As for the privileged prisoners, the situation was more complex. They represented a potent minority within the lager, but a potent majority amongst survivors. To cope with the hard labor beatings, the cold and the illnesses, the meager food ration was insufficient. Death by hunger or by disease induced by hunger was the prisoner's normal destiny, avoidable only with additional food. Obtaining that required whatever it took to lift oneself above the norm. The ascent of the privileged is an anguishing but unfailing phenomena. It is a grey zone, poorly defined, where the 2 camps of masters and servants both diverge and converge. This grey zone possesses an incredibly complicated internal structure and contains within itself enough to confuse our need to judge. The harsher the oppression, the greater, the more widespread among the oppressed is the willingness to collaborate. So the death camps are not binary places where good and evil are easily distinguishable, but places of grey. Hierarchies of oppression and control exist within and between the inmates, as well as between the inmates and the Nazis. Good people did terrible things, and bad people sometimes did good things. You can't comprehend this from outside. This is the important bit to go back to Heidegger. You can't comprehend this from outside. You have to be in the situation, in the place, to work out what is going on here, without any knowledge of the local conditions at the time. The line between right and wrong isn't a line. It's a swamp. It looks more like this. Okay, last example. Sophocles, Antigone. Antigone, born to oppose. It's not about how to lead. It's an array of warnings about leading legitimately within the constraints of the gods. So if you don't know the story of Antigone, let me just explain this very briefly. Set in Thebes, which is anti-democratic. It's the point, it's set in a place which is not like Athens. Oedipus and Jocasta, here we are. He's king one, king one. Oedipus and Jocasta, king of Thebes. They both die, and they leave these 4 children. Polynices, Eteocles, Ismene, and Antigone. This is king 2. Notice the way I put these wonderful comments on so you can see what's going on. Polynices and Eteocles quarrel over the kingship of Thebes, and Polynices, this one, is exiled. And he comes back with an army from Argos. There's a big war, and both Polynices and Eteocles are killed. So these 2 are now dead. So king 1 is dead and king 2 is dead. Don't be a king. This leaves the 2 sisters, Ismene and Antigone. Now, this man, Creon, becomes king 3. He's the brother of this woman, Queen Jocasta, who, let me remind you, is dead. So Creon is now married to Eurydice, and what we have here is the first day of his reign. He argues that this man, the person who left, the person who was exiled, who's now dead, let me remind you, this person shouldn't be buried. This contradicts or contravenes the unwritten law or custom about what you should do with the dead. If you don't bury them, their soul is condemned for eternity. So this sister, Antigone, now wants to bury her brother. But it's against the rule. This is composed by Creon on day 1. Oh, I forgot to say, Antigone's in love with Hymen. This is a bit of a problem because this is their son. So Antigone asks Ismene, her sister, to help bury Polynices, and Ismene refuses. It's forbidden by Creon, and public stoning is the penalty for this. Quote, "If we defy the king's prerogative and break the law, our death would be more shameful, even than theirs. Remember, too, that we are women and not made to fight with men, since they, who rule us now, are stronger far than we. In this, and worse than this, we must obey them." Antigone says, "Your choice is made, but I shall bury him. And if I have to die for this pure crime, I am content. For I shall not rest beside him. For I shall rest beside him." So here's the policy. The policy is you don't do it, and her argument is I'm doing it. Tough. What I want to do is more important than the policy. The policy stinks. She buries him. Creon, discovering the burial, says, "What man has buried him?" One says, "What man has buried him?" A woman couldn't do this. Antigone admits the burial and justifies her behavior on grounds that she is obeying the laws of gods, not man. "Had I neglected him and left him there unburied, that would have caused me grief. This causes none. And if you think it folly, then perhaps I am accused of folly by the fool." That's not a good move. Creon declares Antigone will be executed by stoning. Ismene also accused and declares that Antigone and Creon's son Hymen are lovers. Thanks, sis. That's just screwed it up even worse. Hymen then declares his loyalty to Creon, his dad, but he says this: "The man who thinks he alone is wise, that is best in speech or counsel, such a man brought to the proof is found but emptiness. There's no disgrace, even if one is wise in learning more and knowing when to yield. See how the trees that grow beside a torrent preserve their branches. If they bend, the others, those that resist, are torn out root and branch. So too the captain of a ship. Let him refuse to shorten sail, despite the storm. He'll end his voyage bottom uppermost." And then the chorus, always wise choruses. "My lord, he has not spoken foolishly. You can each learn some wisdom from the other." Creon, "What? Men of our age go to school again and take a lesson from a very boy? Fat chance." So Hyman's appeal for justice is refused, and Hyman says, she will not die alone. Now remember, this is the boyfriend of the woman who's going to be stoned. She will not die alone. And then Crayon changes the sentence from stoning to entombment in the cave. Woohoo! A liberal. Tiresias, who's the blind prophet, then tells Crayon, the king, the idiot, that catastrophe will befall him if he does not release Antigone and bury Polynices. So he sends his guards to release her. Remember that she's been buried in the cave alive, while he buries Polynices. And as Crayon reaches the cave, it becomes apparent that Antigone has hanged herself. Crayon enters the cave to find Hymen, that's his son, embracing the dead Antigone, who's just hanged herself. Hymen draws his sword and tries to kill his father, but he misses, and then he kills himself. And then Crayon's wife turns up. And when she sees what's going on, she stabs herself too. And Crayon says, "Oh, come, best of all the days I can see, the last day of all, the day that brings death." Great happy ending. I love a happy ending. So this is all about, I know what the policy is, but the policy is problematic, so I'm going to break the policy, and then the whole lot goes to God knows where. Now, I want to just finish off by thinking about this. I'm going to hand over to Claire to do a little bit on blame culture, think about why we end up in these strange places. I just want to use some work by Foucault at the end of his life in some of the lectures he gave. He talks about the relationship between the axis of power and the axis of ethics. There's also an axis of knowledge, but we won't talk about that at the moment. So the axis of power is one way of thinking about. These are the external approaches to what you should do, and these are the internal approaches to what you should do. So the axis of power is a rule or a code-oriented governance, policy-based. It's a moral code and it's prescriptive agencies. People will tell you what you should be doing. Whereas the axis of ethics is a strange term for ethics. It's not what we've been talking about already. He talks about ethical responses to a moral code. So it's not what the moral code is, which is on this side. It's what you think you should be doing is the important thing. You're not driven by the external code. You're driven by what you think is right. So on this side, the external approach, you have formal risk management and you have rules. And on this side, you have internal or self-constituted rule-making. On this side, you have compliance to external authority. You're doing this because you have to, because the rule says you have to, and if you don't, we will punish you. What you end up is a very low-risk organization because people are frightened of the punishment systems. And on this side, you have a very autonomous level of responsibility. You have much higher risk because the important point is the learning, not the punishment. This is why you do stuff, because you want to learn what is the right thing to do. So here you have external scrutiny and a kind of universal practice. And here we have internal scrutiny and a local practice. And the point about this is not that this is right and this is wrong or the other way around, but maybe we've got to start thinking about how can you get these two to cross over? How can you get an alignment so people want to do what's right? They don't do what's right because they have to, they do it because they want to. That's a grey zone in the way of combining those two kinds of issues. Any questions before I hand over to Claire? We'll talk about blame culture for 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a break. Any points? Okay, so I just want to think what happens when things go wrong, and Claire will talk you through an approach to blame culture and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so blame, punishment-centred culture. What happens when it all goes pear-shaped? What happens when it does all go wrong? I blame you. That's what tends to happen. It's always someone's fault. It's always got to be someone. Someone needs to be blamed here. Whilst out in Perth, Australia, last December, I was going for a run one morning before a conference, and I came across this. And it was actually placed in the middle of an area of serious bushfire devastation. There'd been a huge bushfire a couple of years ago. And what they'd actually done, what the locals had done, had set up almost a shrine in memory of the people that had lost their lives, livelihoods, and homes in this bushfire. And what the locals in this area were desperate to do was to blame someone. When you lose something, or if you've lost a person who is loved, you love dearly, or something happens in your organisation, where did the fault lie? Somebody or something has to have been part of it. And what the locals did was they put this allocation meter, just spin it. Because actually, these forest fires, these bushfires, could have been any one of these things. The month of December, It's the hottest month of the year. That's when the highest temperatures are there in the area. Is it the weatherman? Has the weatherman actually not predicted that they were going to have these extreme temperatures? Is it the council? Have the council not put precautionary measures in place correctly? Did the council not have the right facilities in place to deal with these bushfires? I'll come back to that one in a minute. It's actually the name of a local man that's crossed out. El Nino, the El Nino winds. Were they actually blowing stronger than normal at that point, blowing the bushfires inland? Campers, irresponsible campers not putting fires out, having unlicensed fires, unlicensed barbecues. Is it lightning? The lightning strikes hitting the ground and causing the fire to start. Euros, it's the European campers and travellers, the backpackers, irresponsible, they tend to be quite young. Are they not following the rules of the fire licensing? Act of God. That's back to the lightning, isn't it? Sometimes accidents just happen. They just do. And this fire could have just been an act of God. That freak lightning strike, it could have just been anything. And of course, irresponsible smokers. The reason why that name is there, he was actually a very, very rich local man whose house and land was surrounded by devastation and fire, and yet he got away unscathed. His family was safe, his business was safe, his home was safe. So a lot of locals resented him and blamed him for it because he had the money to protect himself, but he did nothing to protect the community. So a lot of people blamed him. Blame is not black or white. I find this very useful, and when I was doing, learning to be an air traffic controller, doing my training, going back about 12 years ago, I found this very, very useful. Because they talked a lot in air traffic control and in aviation across the board about this idea of a slip and lapse mistake. Now, slips and lapses can be forgiven. Some mistakes can be given, and this is where there's a big learning area in aviation. But obviously, you cannot forgive the violation. So what James Reason did was he put this together in terms of looking at a classification of errors. So you have an incident happen, a mistake happens, and he looked at it in terms of the black and the white. So you've got the intended action, which is the violation, and these are where you need some very strict rules and regulations and strong moral values. These are the things which are acts of sabotage. These are things that should never be accepted, should never be allowed, and should certainly be punished. You then have the unintended actions, slips, lapses. They tend to be an omission, a mistiming, something you forget. You might have forgotten where you put your keys or forgotten to lock the back door before you go to bed at night. These things happen. You forget your papers for a meeting. Nobody's perfect. We all make these slips and lapses. But the grey area are what we call the mistake. Now, a mistake could be rule-based. Is it the misapplication of a good rule? So it could be someone's interpretation of what in fact is in place is a good rule, a good policy, a good value, but that person has actually just misapplied it. But actually, where it becomes grey is it could be the application of a bad rule. It could actually be a rule that was put in place, but under certain circumstances, actually, it started out as good, but actually it could be bad. It also comes down to knowledge base, where there are many, many variables. And of course, a lot of this is down to experience. Tacit knowledge. Have I seen this before? Have I not seen it before? Is it a new experience? Is it an old experience? And then you've got untested processes. A lot of processes are put into place into organisations, but they're not always put in with the right level of testing or the right level of knowledge or the right level of information. So it's this grey area, these mistakes, that need to be taken on board. And I understand from Keith that many of you probably have seen this before. I think in Keith's lecture he calls it the sweep it under the carpet school of management. So, you've made a mistake. Will it show? No, bury it. Problems avoided. That's it. I don't need to worry about it. Made a mistake. Will it show? Yes. Can I hide it? Yes. Well, if I conceal it before somebody else finds out, the problem is avoided. I haven't got to worry about it. Made a mistake? Yes. Can I hide it? No. Can I blame someone else? Special circumstances or a difficult client? No. Oh, could this damage my career? Yes. Well, if I just sit tight and hope the problem goes away, it'll be fine. But no, if I get in first with my version of events, it'll be fine. The problem will be avoided. How many of you have seen this? Done it? Had to manage this type of situation? I don't think there's one organisation in the world where this doesn't happen. What happens, though, is this becomes what Westrom calls a pathological culture. So all of this happens, and what you end up with is personal responsibility avoided. Failures tend to be punished or covered up because they're punished. The organisation then has the potential of continuing into failure. This is exactly what happened to BP. We all know this story. It's the biggest environmental disaster in history. It beat the Exxon Valdez considerably, and it's still in the news today. April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster. BP, back in 1999, had the Alaska waste dumping fiasco. A report from that identified lots of integrity and ethical issues within BP, but nothing was done about it. 2005 was the Texas City refinery blast. Again, an investigation was undertaken. Integrity issues were identified. Again, nothing was done about it. Employees were just put under more and more pressure to put production ahead of safety and quality. Profit was coming before anything else. Employees who did come forward with concerns, especially about safety or maybe other related issues, actually were sanctioned, and in a couple of cases were actually fired. So immediately what you're doing is instilling this, not just a blame culture, but a fear culture. You're actually making people feel that they have no voice, they cannot speak up, and you're actually pushing their personal moral values down into the ground. So you're getting this sweep it under the carpet school of management. They're burying all the issues. What happened was there was a shutdown in this flow of safety-related information, and BP didn't learn anything. Hence, April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster. 11 dead, huge amounts of environmental damage, corporate image damage beyond, well, it's still going on. It's costing them billions and billions of pounds, to the point where now BP are at risk of takeover. It's what Sidney Dekker calls drift into failure. He talks about rational decision-making, and he says that in complex worlds, therefore, perfect rationality is actually impossible. And he defines perfect rationality in terms of a full knowledge of all relevant information, possible outcomes, relevant goals, i.e., you can only have perfect rationality if you know absolutely everything. And we all know we cannot physically know absolutely everything. So he actually describes it in terms of human rationality as being local. You only know what is going on immediately around you. And this drift into failure mirrors Heidegger's dwelling quite nicely, I think, in terms of the fact that decision-making under complex situations judgments can only be made under uncertainty. There's a lot of ambiguity, and a lot of the time, especially in critical decisions, you have extreme time pressures. It's all governed by people's local understanding, focus of attention, goals, and knowledge. He argues, complexities can lead to what might work locally, but not what is working globally, because of limited access to information and possible solutions. So BP, by not taking into account their integrity issues and by cutting off the communication channels, basically, of their employees to come forward and explain or report any issues or concerns that they had, they were cutting off all this information. So they only knew what was going on locally, and so did the staff. And what happened was there was no organisational learning, i.e., BP drifted into failure. Another way to look at this is in terms of first story and second story accounts. Organisations that tend to be called hard shell. These are organisations where there's huge amounts of processes, loads of policies, loads of systems. They've got everything in place because they think they know everything. They think there's a perfect rationality. So they think they've got all bases covered. So externally, the reason why they're known as hard shell is externally they're very strong because they've got everything. They've dotted the I's, they've crossed the T's. In fact, what it is actually they're very, very brittle. Because what actually they're doing is they're taking personal responsibility away from people by thinking that it's actually perfect, but it's not at all. And they actually are at high risk of breaking. And these organisations see human error as the main cause of failure, whether it be intended or unintended, as Jane Reason's classification of errors highlighted. They tend to be organisations where they go back and say what people should have done to satisfy and come up with that blame for the failure. They tell people to then be more careful and then the problem will go away. They sweep it under the carpet. Second story accounts tend to be what we call soft shell organisations, because these organisations don't necessarily have what they call these perfect processes and systems in place. They allow people a little bit more flexibility. They allow people a certain element of personal responsibility. So externally, they may look very, very weak, but actually, they're designed to be resilient. There's the flex in the system for people to take into account what's going on around them. So there's a capacity to learn and actually put errors right. Human errors in second story accounts, soft shell organisations, tend to be seen as the effect of systemic vulnerabilities deeper inside the organisation. So it's not just the individual, it's not just the person, but it could be the rules and policies weren't right. It could be the training isn't right, or the person's not been recruited appropriately for that role. There could be a multitude of different things. In organisations where equipment is used, it might be the wrong equipment, it might not have been serviceable. There's other vulnerabilities. The other important point is saying what people should have done does not explain why it made sense for them to do what they did. Again, it's back to Heidegger. It's taking into account the situation, the space. And I can speak about this personally when I was involved in an incident in air traffic. What happened is, when it then went under investigation, was that the investigators were putting words in my mouth. They were telling me what I should say. And what frustrated me beyond belief was the fact that they weren't there. I was there. I know what happened. But they weren't listening to me because they believed they knew what happened. And they were just looking for someone to blame. And actually, that's where, towards the end of my air traffic control career, I went into unit investigation and I rehashed the whole of the unit investigation process to take a lot of this more into account. Only by constantly seeking out vulnerabilities can organisations enhance safety. It's back to this capacity to learn and rectify errors. What happens in a lot of organisations is you have the blunt end and the sharp end. Has anyone heard of this and heard organisations described as this before? Where what you have is the people at the blunt end tend to be regulators, administrators, your managers. They're the people that put things in place. They're the people that put the rules, regulations, processes, systems. You then have the people at the sharp end. They're the practitioners. These are the people doing the job. They're the ones at the front line actually doing what it is that they're supposed to do. These are whether or not you call it the air traffic controller, your nurse, your pilot, your police officer, versus your regulators, senior management. People at the sharp end tend to inherit the accident rather than be the cause of it, because a lot of what goes on at this blunt end is actually a failure to appreciate the information, what the sharp end are telling them. Success and failure are a result of how sharp-end practitioners cope with complexity and how their actions are shaped by resources and constraints at those at the blunt end. An example of this is the story of Alison Hume. What happened was Alison Hume was out walking her dog one day and she decided to take a shortcut coming home. And after 4 hours, her daughter was concerned as to where her mother was. So she raised the alarm, went out looking for her. She found her mother had fallen down a disused mine shaft. So she called the emergency services. The emergency services came along, and the fire service, paramedics, police stood above ground. They actually did send one fire officer down on this hoist that they'd got. They sent a fire officer down with some oxygen to sit and keep her company. The rest of the emergency services stood above ground and argued for up to 6 hours. 6 hours arguing about the fact that they couldn't get Alison out on this hoist because it could not be used by any member of the public. They couldn't get a paramedic down to give her the proper treatment she needed because no other emergency service could use this hoisting equipment except for a trained fire officer. The only trained fire officer was the one they'd already put down the mine to sit with her and comfort her and give her oxygen. 6 hours. Alison unfortunately died whilst this was going on. And this was because of a regulation that had been put in place by the blunt end, by senior regulatory fire officers, which had then been interpreted by the fire officers on duty this day to basically mean that no one else could use this equipment but a qualified fire officer. Just 90 minutes away, down the road, was the Scottish Cave and Rescue Organisation. And their team leader, Alan Jeffreys, was reported in the BBC as saying, "But in a situation where there is human life involved, I think some large injection of common sense is called for. I would employ the Latin expression, seize the moment and deal with the matter, and sort out the breaking of rules and regulations later." The Scottish Cave and Rescue Organisation are a voluntary organisation. They are not subject to the same rules and regulations as the fire service. Blunt End not putting processes in place that actually fit with the sharp end's job, but also the sharp end then misinterpreting what the blunt end are talking about. It goes on all the time in organisations. To help understand this and come back to what Keith was saying as well about relationships, the importance of relationships, he spoke about Alveston and Svensson, the extraordinarisation of the mundane. Did I say it right? I always struggle with that word, extraordinarisation. It comes back to this idea of who's accountable and who's responsible. And I know when I first heard these two words in my air traffic control training, I assumed them to mean the same thing. Actually, when you look at the definitions, and especially when you look deeper down in terms of the role of accountability and responsibility when you're looking at blame culture, accountable are those at the blunt end. They're the people that are doing the training or putting training in place. They're the people selecting people, making sure equipment is appropriate, environment, the support, management, everything that goes within the organisation and keeps the organisation running. The people at the sharp end, who are actually doing the job, they have a duty to act on their own, to do the job safely, but they also are responsible for reporting these observations and unusual situations that are coming about. But they're only going to do that and take personal responsibility if you have this openness and relationship space in the middle. There has to be processes in place for those that are accountable and those that are responsible to talk to each other and vice versa. And if that's not there, then you get the drift into failure and you're not getting an organisation learning. As Decker himself says, unjust responses to failure are almost never the result of bad performance. They are the result of bad relationships. So to go back to this is a utopian ideal. This is never going to be. But what you need to look at, and in terms of aviation, and talking to colleagues or ex-colleagues that still work in air traffic, a lot of friends of mine that are pilots in aviation for airlines and also work within airport environments, even the Royal Air Force, they like to believe that although they know this cannot be achieved 100% of the time, they have cultural aims to get this to be at least 60 to 70% of the time. This idea of a just culture, or what Westrum calls a generative culture, which is where you allow people, when they make a mistake, this grey area of a mistake, will it show, yes, I don't need to hide it. Could be partly my fault, but it's likely that there are other factors involved. I have a responsibility as the person at the sharp end, as the person that's doing my job, to prevent it happening again. So, I can admit it. I can report it through an appropriate channel. It'll get investigated. Organisational learning will occur. The idea is there's going to be personal responsibility taken by employees. The organisation will continue to improve, and everyone will know why. Thank you. If you're interested in just culture and generative culture, actually, Sidney Decker has written a very, very good book on just culture, and it's not very thick, and it's actually quite an interesting, enlightening read.
Okay, thank you. Last two slides, and then we're going to have a break. So I want to finish off with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So his book written for his son about how you deal with life, basically. And he argues there are three things you need to start thinking about in terms of how you deal with life. There's a body of theoretical knowledge you need, episteme, which would be in this sense that we've been talking about today, the knowledge that we've been talking about, Kantian, deontological, blah, 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 theoretical knowledge. You also need a series of replicable skills, what he calls techne. These are the ability to be able to employ what you've learned and to do it in practice, the skills that you need to practice. What happens when this goes wrong? Well, last time it happened, I did this. But the third thing that Aristotle talks about is the importance of what he calls practical wisdom, or phronesis. So it's not just good enough having a body of theoretical knowledge. It's not just good enough having a series of policies, even if you agree with them. That isn't enough. And it isn't enough just to be able to say, when this happened, I applied this kind of skill and I learned from it. What happens is this. How do you get to practical wisdom? And for Aristotle in particular, practical wisdom is about applying the knowledge in a particular example, a particular case, which will probably not be repeated because each time it's slightly different, and to understand that sometimes you screw up. And you learn a lot from the screw up, and you probably learn a lot from when you get it right too. So it's how you reflect on what you've just done. That gives you the practical wisdom. So for Aristotle, you don't get a lot of very wise, very young people. You have to be a grumpy old git to become wise, because you've learnt so much by the failures that you've made, one after the other. And hopefully, at some point, you begin to avoid using too many of those approaches to failure. So I just want to finish off by thinking about how the word leadership comes about. So the English word leadership comes from a Norse word, leid, meaning to set the direction. And what's worth thinking about is neither the knowledge that we have, the episteme, the science, or the skills can tell us which direction to go in. They can tell you whether something is true, and they can tell you about how to do something, but they can't tell you which direction to go in. The direction you should go on, or go in, is about phronesis. It's about the wisdom to know, in this particular situation, this is the direction we should go in. Okay, let's have a break. It's now 1:15. Let's come back in at 1:45. Thank you. Any questions or points you'd like to raise at this point before we get you to do some work on the tables? Okay. In that case, this is what we're going to do. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes?
What do you want us to do with that? A lot of information.
Yes. I want you to hold on to that question until we get to the end. I want you to do a bit of I want you to do some work now, which might clarify what I want you to do with that. Anything else apart from that? Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to give you a very short case study to work on. We do this in 3 sections. I want you to read the case study. We'll give them out in a minute. One of the people on your table will be a member of this case, but not involved in the first discussion. So I'm going to give you the cases. You're going to read it. Take you about 3 or 4 minutes to read it, understand it. One person on the table will not be engaged in the first part of the conversation because they're part of the case. We will allocate those to the people that have annoyed me most. Sometimes there'll be 2 or 3 people on the same table. So we'll give you a case ready to read. Then we're going to give you about 20 minutes to think about, given the case, what might a response be given the 2 primary approaches to ethical approaches, i.e., so what would be a deontological approach and what would be a consequentialist approach to this particular problem, okay? And the second part of the case, the person that we're going to choose on the table has a slightly different script because they're part of the case. And the second part of the conversation, we'll tell you what the timings are, the second part of the conversation is for you to engage in a conversation with this person and to see whether you can work out, given the slightly different context, given what Heidegger would call the dwelling, would there be a different response? And the third part, we'll just get some feedback from the tables. We'll try and do this in 20-minute blocks. So the first 20 minutes is everybody except the person who we're going to allocate as Ben. Everybody except Ben engages in a conversation about how you might respond to this case. Ben can sit in, but not engage in the conversation. The second part of the conversation is you as a collective have to engage in the conversation with Ben about is there a different way of resolving or addressing this problem. The third part is just some feedback to the plenary group. Is that clear? So I'm now going to pick a Ben, and Claire will give out the cases. And then we're going to give you about 20 minutes just to do the first part. The instructions are on the piece of paper. About 20 minutes, and then I'll give you a shout, and at that point, Ben can come into the conversation, and you need to engage in the conversation with Ben about what else we might do. So I'm giving out the Ben stuff. So Ben, whoever you are, don't let the rest see your information. Ben.